The rain was relentless, pouring down in heavy sheets as I pulled up to the familiar house in a quiet Denver neighborhood. It had been a spur-of-the-moment decision to visit. Ryan, my best friend since high school, had always told me I was welcome anytime, but I hadn't called ahead this time. I figured it'd be a nice surprise. The downpour blurred the driveway as I stepped out of my car, quickly pulling my jacket over my head to shield myself. As I climbed the porch steps, the door opened before I could knock. Josh, Susan, Ryan's mom, stood in the doorway, holding a white and gray tabby cat. Her expression was a mix of surprise and warmth. "What are you doing here in this weather?" Her voice was soft, welcoming, just as I remembered. Over the years, I'd come to know Susan as one of the most approachable adults in my life, kind, witty, and unpretentious. "Hi, Susan," I said, brushing raindrops from my sleeves. I thought I'd stop by and say hi to Ryan, but I trailed off, realizing he probably wasn't home. "You just missed him," she said with a small laugh, stepping aside. "He's out of town for a couple of weeks. But come on in, you're going to drown out there." Grateful for the invitation, I stepped into the warmth of the house. The familiar scent of brewed coffee and polished wood hit me instantly, wrapping around me like an old memory. Susan gently set the cat down, and it promptly trotted off to the living room. "I didn't know you had a cat," I said, watching the feline leap gracefully onto the couch. "Oh, that's Bonnie," she said, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Ryan insisted I adopt her. He said I needed company now that he's away." Bonnie, as if sensing she was the topic of conversation, turned her wide, curious eyes toward me and gave a small meow. I chuckled and Susan did the same, the sound lightening the room. "Tea? Coffee?" she offered as I shrugged off my jacket. "Tea would be great," I replied, following her to the kitchen. While she prepared the tea, I glanced around. Everything in the house was exactly as I remembered, tidy, cozy, and filled with touches of Susan's personality. Artwork hung on the walls, and the bookshelves overflowed with novels and art books. When we settled into the living room, Bonnie had claimed the middle cushion of the couch, forcing me to take one end while Susan sat on the other. The rain outside became a rhythmic backdrop as we chatted about everything and nothing. "It must be quiet around here without Ryan," I said, breaking a brief silence. "It is," she admitted, stroking Bonnie, who purred under her touch. "But quiet isn't always bad. I've started reading more and the garden's getting more attention than ever." We laughed, and the conversation drifted to books, movies, and eventually her aspirations. She mentioned how she once dreamed of becoming an artist before life took her down another path. "You could still pick it up," I said, genuinely intrigued. She smiled blissfully. "Maybe." As the rain intensified, so did the atmosphere inside. There was an ease to our conversation, but beneath it, something else lingered, unspoken, unacknowledged. Bonnie stretched between us, bridging the gap with her presence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this stormy evening would leave its mark in ways I hadn't yet begun to understand. The rain showed no sign of letting up. It drummed steadily against the windows, filling the silence between our words with its rhythmic cadence. The room felt warmer now, though not just from the tea or the comforting hum of the house. Something unspoken lingered between us, as if the storm outside had crept in and stirred the air. Susan leaned back in her chair, the glow of the lamp casting soft shadows across her face. She was laughing at something I'd said, an anecdote about one of my recent word projects, but her laughter held a lightness I hadn't seen in her before. It was contagious, and I found myself laughing with her, the kind of laughter that dissolved the distance between two people. "You're a great storyteller, Josh," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. I smiled, feeling a bit more confident than I expected. "Well, it helps to have someone who actually listens." She glanced down, her fingers grazing the edge of her mug. "I guess I don't get to do that much these days." Conversations like this, they're rare. Her voice softened on the last word, and for a moment, the room seemed quieter. Bonnie, curled up on the couch between us, let out a lazy purr as if to punctuate the pause. "You deserve that," I said, leaning forward slightly. "People to talk to really talk to." She looked up, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but I think I've gotten used to not expecting much." The vulnerability in her tone caught me off guard. I wanted to say something, anything, to lift the weight I sensed behind her words. But before I could, a flash of lightning illuminated the room, and the rumble of thunder followed close behind. Susan stood abruptly, walking over to the window. "It's really coming down out there," she said, her back to me. I watched her silhouette against the glass, the way she absentmindedly rested her hand on the window frame. She looked serene, yet lost in thought. "I don't mind staying," I said, surprising even myself with the way the words came out. I don't mind waiting out the storm. It's nice here." She turned to face me, and for the first time, I noticed the conflict in her expression. Like she was searching for the right thing to say but couldn't quite find it. Instead, she smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Do you always say exactly what's on your mind, Josh?" she asked, half teasing, half serious. "Not always," I admitted, "but I feel like I should tonight." Her gaze lingered on mine for a moment too long, and the silence between us grew heavier. Bonnie stretched lazily, then leaped off the couch and trotted toward her bed in the corner, leaving us alone. The absence of her small presence only heightened the tension in the room. "Susan," I started, my voice low, "you're incredible. I don't think I've ever told you that." Her brow furrowed slightly, as if she wasn't sure whether to take the compliment seriously. But then something shifted in her demeanor. She stepped closer, slowly, almost cautiously. "Josh," she said softly, her tone somewhere between a question and a statement. I didn't give myself time to second guess. I leaned forward, bridging the small distance between us. Our eyes met, and in that fleeting second, the storm outside seemed to fade into nothingness. When our lips finally met, it was hesitant but electric, like the first strike of lightning in a clear sky. The kiss was brief, almost uncertain, but when I pulled back, her expression was unreadable, some mix of surprise and something deeper. She brought a hand to her lips, as if testing whether it had really happened. "That was unexpected," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "Yeah," I agreed, my pulse racing. "But it felt right." She didn't respond, not immediately. Instead, she turned back to the window, her reflection faint against the rain-streaked glass. Bonnie let out a soft leo from her corner, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. And though the room was quiet again, the air between us crackled with something new, something neither of us could ignore. The house had grown quiet, save for the faint patter of rain against the windows. The earlier lightheartedness had dissolved, leaving behind a charged atmosphere. Susan sat across from me, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of a throw pillow on her lap. Her gaze occasionally flickered toward me, only to quickly retreat. It felt as if every word now carried weight, every moment stretched with meaning. Bonnie had disappeared, slipping out of the room like she knew we needed space. The absence of her calming presence made the tension between us feel even more palpable. "Susan," I finally said, breaking the silence. My voice came out softer than I intended. She looked up, her expression guarded but curious. "About earlier," I began, my words trailing off as I searched for the right thing to say. I didn't mean to make things awkward." She tilted her head slightly, a fake smile tugging at her lips. "Josh, you don't need to apologize. It's just unexpected." Her words hung in the air, and I could tell she was trying to sort through her own thoughts as much as I was. She stood suddenly, walking toward the window where the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. "I don't even know how to explain this," she said, her back to me. Her voice carried a vulnerability I wasn't used to hearing from her. "You're Ryan's best friend. And me? I'm just what?" I asked, rising to my feet. She turned to face me, her arms crossed tightly against her chest as if to shield herself. "His mom. I'm supposed to be the one with all the answers, the one who has everything under control." I took a step closer, keeping my voice steady. "You're more than that, Susan. You're amazing. You've always been more than just Ryan's mom." She looked at me, her defenses faltering. For a moment, the distance between us felt insurmountable, but then her gaze softened. "Josh, you're kind," she said, almost whispering. "But this is complicated. You know that, right?" "I know," I replied, taking another step closer. "But sometimes the best things in life are." Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to protest but couldn't find the words. The air between us grew heavier, like the moments before a storm unleashes its fury. I reached out, hesitant but deliberate, and gently took her hand in mine. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't pull away. "Susan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "we don't have to figure everything out tonight. But don't tell me this doesn't mean something." She looked down at our intertwined hands, her expression a mix of fear and something deeper, something that mirrored what I felt. Before either of us could say another word, Bonnie reappeared, hopping gracefully onto the back of the couch. She let out a soft, almost approving Leo, breaking the tension. We both laughed nervously, the spell of the moment momentarily broken. Susan shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "That cat has impeccable timing. Maybe she's trying to keep us grounded, I joked, though my heart was still racing. As we both sat back down, the intensity of the moment lingered, though it felt less daunting now. Susan leaned back in her chair, her eyes meeting mine with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "We'll talk more," she said finally, "but not tonight." I nodded, understanding the weight of what she was saying. Outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, but the storm between us wasn't over yet. Still, for the first time, it felt like we weathered it together. The rain had finally eased into a gentle drizzle, the kind that barely made a sound against the window. Dawn was approaching, and the faintest hints of light crept over the horizon, illuminating the edges of the room. Susan sat quietly on the couch, her hands folded in her lap as Bonnie perched nearby, her tail flicking lazily. The night had been long, and the weight of everything that had passed between us lingered in the air. I stood by the window, gazing out at the misty garden. The world outside looked refreshed, cleansed by the storm, but the turmoil inside me hadn't yet settled. I turned back towards Susan, who seemed lost in her thoughts. "You shouldn't have stayed," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but carried an unmistakable edge of doubt. "You invited me in." I reminded her gently. "You could have said no." She sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly as if she carried a burden too heavy to bear. "Josh," she began, her tone quiet but deliberate. "What happened tonight? It can't happen again. It's not fair to you, to me, to Ryan." The mention of Ryan's name was like a cold dust of wind. I'd avoided thinking about him all night, but now his presence loomed large even in his absence. Susan glanced at me, her eyes filled with worry. "Do you think he'd understand?" she asked, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath and stepped closer to her. "I think he loves you, Susan, and I think he'd understand that you're more than just his mom. You're a person who deserves to be happy." Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Instead, she looked down at her hands, fidgeting with a loose thread on the cushion beside her. "You make it sound so simple," she said finally, her tone tinged with both longing and uncertainty. "It's not simple," I admitted, "but that doesn't mean it's wrong." Bonnie jumped onto her lap, purring softly as Susan absent-mindedly stroked her fur. The cat seemed to be offering comfort, a reminder that sometimes the simplest gestures could ease the heaviest of hearts. "I don't know what to do," Susan whispered, her gaze fixed on the cat. I knelt down in front of her, gently taking her free hand in mine. "We figure it out. Together. One step at a time." She looked up at me then, her eyes shimmering with unspoken emotion. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The room was filled with the faint sound of Bonnie's purring and the distant drip of water outside. Finally, she nodded, her lips curving into a small, hesitant smile. "Okay, but not right away. I need time. And we need to be careful." I squeezed her hand, letting her know I understood. "Whatever you need, Susan, I'm here." The soft glow of morning began to fill the room, casting everything in a golden hue. The storm was over, but its effects would linger, shaping the path ahead. Susan stood, Bonnie hopping gracefully off her lap. She walked toward the window, staring out at the world that now seemed new and untouched. "Josh," she said after a moment, turning back to me. "Thank you for not giving up on me." I smiled, the tension in my chest easing for the first time all night. I couldn't if I tried. As the sun began to rise, its light spilling into the room, it felt like a new chapter was beginning, not just for me and Susan, but for everything. The storm had cleared, leaving behind the possibility of something neither of us had anticipated. But for the first time, it felt like we were ready to face it together.